Hi, and welcome to this short webinar around the subject of habits. This is a reintroduction of a very simple model. It's an old model, but nonetheless it has a lot of implications when talking about development and developing ourselves. There's a lovely phrase: first we create our habits and then our habits create us. We're not born with habits. Our habits are generated over a lifetime. Quite often, one of the lovely bits of feedback I think that I was received, or descriptions around the programs that we run, was given to us by a client who turned around and said it's a little bit like putting the car in for service. You know, when you put the car in for service, it's not broken. It just needs cleaning out, and in order to make it work more efficiently and get the best out of that particular vehicle. And of course, the higher the spec the car, then quite often the more regular the servicing. And the question I ask of groups is, when was the last time we put ourselves in for service? Because as we go through life, as we go through our work and our daily routines, we start to generate habits. We create habits. And some of these habits are useful and some are not so useful. And what we need to do is just to service ourselves, to remind ourselves, put ourselves back into the conscious, become aware of what some of those habits are that we have acquired, and then obviously implicate some sort of changes to get rid of those habits that are no longer helping us, and in order also to develop those habits which are helping us and on that particular journey at that particular time. But these habits that we generate are useful in a time space. So the habits that we had when we were 18, 19, 20 were perhaps not necessarily useful in our 40s or 50s, because life changes and the journey continues. So let me introduce or reintroduce the model that we talked about in our programs. And it's again, as I stress, it's a simple model, but nonetheless it's a very powerful model. 4 steps to learning. So the first level is the unconscious incompetence. This is where we don't know. Ignorant bliss, a great place to be. Next level being the conscious incompetence. This is where I now know I don't know. And here we experience some emotions. Here it's a little bit scary. We don't know what's happening. We start to experience fear, nervous, worry, anxiety. But if we keep progressing on that development, we get to the conscious competence, which is where I can do it, but I have to think about it. It doesn't come natural, but I am competent. I am able to access my ability, but it just takes a lot of thought. And of course, finally, we reach that utopic level of the unconscious competence, where I no longer have to think about it. I just do it naturally. And we say it's become a habit. Now, the thing with habits, some habits are really, really useful to us, but other habits are not so useful. And that's the distinction that we have to work through. But of course, by definition, the problem with a habit, it's in the unconscious. We're not necessarily aware of the habits that we've acquired that are necessarily holding us back. And when we talk about habits, we're talking about habitual ways that we think, the habitual ways that we talk, the language that we use, habitual ways that we use our physiology, our body, just our habitual behaviors as we go through life, the way that we communicate to people, the way that we filter things, situations and experiences. These are all habits that we have generated over a lifetime. And some of those habits will be really useful and helping us, but others won't be. But the difficulty is, of course, the ones that any habit is in the unconscious and we're not aware of it. So we have to have a mechanism in some shape or form to be able to switch off that autopilot and bring ourselves back into the conscious. Now, I remember a very simple story of how quickly these habits arrive in our lives. I was doing a conference speech in Nice, and funnily enough, the account manager decided that had to come and with me on that particular client and on that particular meeting. Perhaps if it was Watford, they wouldn't have been quite so keen, but nonetheless, they came with me to Nice. And at the end of the speech, the account manager came up to me and said, "Do you know you've got a bit of a habit?" And I said, "Well, I've got lots of habits, thank you very much indeed. But no, I'm interested." So you keep using the phrase bits and pieces. Now, it was a phrase I recognized. It was a phrase that I recognized as something that I used, but I thought, oh, okay, thank you for that. About 3-4 days later, I'm working with a group with the NHS in London. And at the end of the day, somebody came up to me at the end and said, great day, thanks, Keith, loved it. But can I just give you some feedback? I got a little bit annoyed with the amount of times you use the phrase bits and pieces. It just became a bit annoying. And it hit me as a thunderbolt. It's like, what? And you know, twice in a week I'd been given this feedback. And where did it come from? Why had I really started to use that phrase as often? So I put an email out to the company and said, if anybody recognizes me using the phrase bits and pieces, then they must stop me. On the Monday, I flew to Ireland and we had a team meeting in Ireland with a group. And at the end of the meeting, I said, one of the guys said, is that the end of the meeting? I said, well, yeah. He said, oh, damn it. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, we were having a wager on how often you said bits and pieces. I said, well, I know I said it about 5 or 6 times. He says, no, you got 32 in. 32 in a 2-hour meeting. And I was totally unconscious of it. So every group I sat with, I said, stop me if you hear me use the phrase. And it took another 5-7 days for that habit to be squashed out of my presentations. Where did it come from? I've no idea. It just arrived like that and certainly wasn't helping my presentations. And we have lots and lots of examples of these. As I say, the way that we filter our lives, the way that we see people, the way that we talk, the way that we communicate, all of these are driven by our habits. So we have to have some form of mechanism of switching off that autopilot and bringing ourselves into the conscious. Of course, the most powerful mechanism that I have is my journal. By writing in this journal on a regular basis, remember it's not a daily basis, I write it as and when, but small little snippets, things that I notice in my life or what I'm doing, the way I'm behaving, what's going on. And my responses, all of those sort of things. But that allows me to switch off my autopilot and become aware of my habits. And of course, when I become aware of those habits, I bring myself into the conscious. But then I've got to go through that rigmarole, because when I come down to the conscious and try to change a habit, I start to experience, or I hit that wall that's in front of me, and I start to experience those negative emotions that exist at that level. You know, the things of fear, nervous, worry, anxiety, disappointment, regret, all of those things start to kick in. And the danger is I catch that horrible disease called excusitis, more rampant than COVID-19. But I hit that wall, catch excusitis, and I bounce back to my unconscious competence, back to my old habit, and I use excuses to justify why I'm not going to change. I must be prepared to put the effort in to go through that barrier, to break through the barrier that exists, experience the frustrations of the conscious competence in order to develop a new habit. Indeed, these webinars are exactly that process for me. I had to change some of my old habits. I had to bring myself into the conscious incompetence around technology, on how to use the various pieces of equipment that are available to us in order to communicate to people in a different way. And you know, at the present moment in time, I am definitely moving from the conscious incompetence through to the conscious competence. I think I'm still more on the conscious incompetence side, but I'm learning and I'm growing, I'm developing, and of course, in time, then yes, I will end up creating a new set of habits, and yeah, and as a consequence, I will grow and develop, and that will be useful in today's world. So, just a reminder, we've got these 4 steps. We have to go through them. We have habits. We have to have some form of mechanism of being able to identify our habits to bring ourselves into the conscious. I have to be able to cope with emotions that exist at the conscious incompetence as I try to redevelop my new habits and to change my habits and create new habits. And remembering that those habits might be around things like at home, things that the way I'm working, the way I'm living my life, getting my life-work balance, all of these are driven by our habits. And we have to just constantly review. This is constant work in progress. It never ends. It's a permanent cycle. So hopefully you enjoyed that little reminder around where habits sit and how important it is for us to make those changes in order to continue that growth. Thank you for listening. Stay safe.